Around 8:15 on Monday, February 13th, police received the first of hundreds of 911 calls reporting shots fired in Berkey Hall on the campus of Michigan State University. Survivor and student of MSU, Claire Papuya, said it had been a regular evening in history class with her about 20 classmates when she suddenly heard 3 or 4 gunshots directly behind her head. Papuya said gunman Anthony Dwayne McRae came through the back of the classroom and just started attacking people, not saying a word. She says she dropped to the floor with her classmates, thinking she was gonna die right then. She said, quote, "I will never forget the screams of my classmates. They were screaming in pain and for help," end quote. Some students were barricading doors and others were breaking and jumping out of windows to try to get to safety. This is what thousands of students experienced in a place they should be able to call home, a place where their safety should not be in question. This is the reality of a school shooting. Today, I'm joined by 3 special guests, Dr. Jessica Ward, UND Associate Vice President and Dean of Students, and also Title IX Coordinator, as well as UND Chief of Police Brandon Pate, and Political Science Professor Dr. Laura Wilson. Thank you all for being here today. Dr. Wilson, can you please explain what the exact gun laws in the United States are right now at the federal level?
Sure. Well, they're very complicated, and you specified federal, which is smart, because there are a lot of different state variations that we see. But probably the most important thing at the federal level was bipartisan legislation that passed last summer in 2022 involving funding for state differences. So in particular, we are a red flag state, and there are a dozen or so of those where it's a state that recognizes if there's something wrong in advance to make sure certain individuals don't have access to guns. And part of what this bipartisan legislation at the federal level did was provide funding for implementing and evaluating those kind of policies. Oftentimes states might be interested in doing more, but they simply don't have the funds or the appropriations, the measures to do it.
Can you specify what is different about Indiana's gun laws as well?
Sure. Well, we have a lot of, a lack of restrictions, one might say. In the state legislature last year, they got rid of the requirement for permits. There have been questions about who can have a gun and how much. Generally speaking, we're lax, so we don't have as many restrictions. And ideologically, that fits what we would expect in Indiana. We tend to be a more conservative state. That matches up with the perspectives of many in the Hoosier state, and our gun laws do reflect those ideas.
Thank you. Officer Pate, I imagine you've had to undergo some sort of tragedy training or whatever phrase that you guys may use. Did you go through training specifically for active shooting situations, and can you speak to what that entailed?
Yes. Every officer goes through an initial active shooter response training, and it's very basic, and it's geared towards identifying the threat, locating the threat, and then mitigating it. As you progress through your career, you can choose to get into more advanced trainings. So how to actually clear rooms or how to prevent active shooters, talk about the planning, response, and recovery, the 3 phases of an active shooter. Several of our officers do take a big focus in active shooter in that we lean into the FEMA style training where we go through full-scale events, we go through scenarios, walkthroughs, drills, so that we practice it like clockwork. But yes, every officer that you see on the street will have received some sort of active shooter training as a baseline, and from there you can advance.
I'm sure, not to assume about any of your past in the police department, but I'm sure that you've seen some crazy things in your day. How do you mentally prepare for these types of tragic events?
I don't think you can, to be honest with you. I've been fortunate to train with a lot of people who have been through a lot of stuff. Some of those I've trained with FBI, I've trained with military. You can't really sit down and prepare yourself for the moment you walk through a doorway and see tragedy. You can go through all the scenarios with moulage where they put the blood on people and things like that, but it's never going to compare to the screams, never going to compare to the smells, never going to compare to the actual sights and sounds. Unless you've actually been to a shooting or you've seen someone who was dealing with being shot and you've actually had to work on a person, you're not ready for it. So to add the part of your question, most officers, when they're arriving, it's the first time they've ever seen it too. So they're going through some of the same initial trauma that the people in the event are going through, because they're also looking at it going, holy cow, I've never been in this situation before and I have to act. So it can be tough when you've not had that kind of experience or that exposure. And that's something that we try to train for, is get them as close to that exposure and experience as we possibly can, to where they can at least fight through that initial shock, the initial, wow, what's happening right now? Because you need to be on focus.
Absolutely. And I'm sure that's a tough thing to experience, just in training. So I can only imagine how tough it can be to actually see it in person. A 2004 study by the U.S. Secret Service and U.S. Department of Education found that nearly 3/4 of school shooters had been bullied or harassed at school. Is this what you all, and I'll take opinions from any of you, is this what you see as a leading cause of some of these horrific events?
I would say I feel comfortable and safe on our campus because of the support systems we have. And I say that as a professor who, I obviously don't lock my classroom door. I have students know when I'm in my office. We post the office hours. But at least here on our campus, because there are so many resources, because there are connections and processes, if I feel a student is hurt or needs help, I know who to help connect them with. And I'm sure Michigan State had great resources too, so it's not to say that they lack those, but I think having that kind of community and a network and a process and understanding, at least for me as someone in the classroom, it mitigates my concern that a crisis like that could happen here.
Absolutely.
I'm not an expert by any means on the reason of school shooters, but I would think obviously mental health makes a big difference. We actually on this campus have 2 different teams that work with any concerns that are brought up. And so one of those is a behavioral intervention team that meets regularly to talk about if there's any type of concerns that we've had, if it's a situation where someone seems like they're really struggling in some way. And then if we ever feel like there's a threat to campus, then we have a threat team as well that me and Chief Pate here sit on together. He also is on the behavioral intervention team. So bringing together kind of an interdisciplinary group to talk about if there is a threat, if it seems like it's a credible threat, and what needs to happen as a result for that. And obviously, mental health is a huge aspect of that, and so our counseling center director, Kelly Miller, is also on that team, both of those.
Absolutely, and I think it's so important that we do have access to those resources, so it's very comforting to know that we do have those things available to us on campus. We're going to step away for a quick break here, but when we come back, we'll be covering more of these special topics.
Are you feeling alone in your faith? UIndy Catholic gives you an opportunity to get involved in a religious community on campus, providing sacramental needs and fellowship for prospective students and giving you a sense of belonging.
We just want you guys to know that God loves you, He delights in you, and He's in awe of you, and we would love to meet you. So you should come on out.
UIndy Catholic, a community for you.
For children who may have high-functioning autism, may have ADHD, processing challenges, working memory issues, sensory integration issues, those types of challenges. It's a place where human beings are valued, children are respected. It's a progressive school that takes a hands-on approach to education.
All right, Jake, who you got? Tennessee, Georgia.
Georgia, easily, man.
Come on, Tennessee's 8.5-point dogs. Easiest spread of all time.
How?
Because they're good, and Georgia's played nobody.
At least Georgia has a defense.
Oh, come on. You're an IU fan. Your opinion doesn't matter.
My opinion doesn't matter. The only thing you know as a Purdue fan is how to lose to a 15 seed in the March Madness tournament.
We're bowl eligible, my guy. Are you? Make sure to tune in to Last Call Monday nights. We'll talk about Division I football, give you plenty of UIndy sports, some interviews in there as well, and then plenty of pro sports, whether it be NFL, MLB, the whole shebang.
Yeah, and there's at least one guy that knows what he's talking about.
Thank you for joining me back here on Real Talk. In a recent Pew Research Center survey, roughly a third of parents of children in K through 12 schools say they are very or extremely worried about a shooting ever happening at their children's school. That's a pretty scary statistic in my mind. According to an article written by Alexia Blom on thetrace.org, it's an axiom of the pro-gun movement that mass shooters target gun-free zones. According to that logic, the presence of armed guards should deter shooters. But the record usually doesn't back up the deterrence theory. Gunmen have often entered and targeted schools with armed guards. In 4 high-profile 2018 school shootings, specifically Kentucky's Marshall County High School, Florida's Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School, Maryland's Great Mills High School, and Santa Fe High School in Texas, attackers stormed campuses despite the presence of these armed guards. And in all 4 of those cases, guards failed to stop the gunmen from killing. So more generally, active shooters do not necessarily favor those gun-free zones. Louis Clarevas, a professor at the University of Massachusetts, analyzed 111 school shooting attacks between 1966 and 2015 for his book Rampage Nation, and found that only 18 of those took place in areas where firearms were banned. Officer Pate, does this surprise you at all, and can you maybe help us understand why armed guards would actually not deter these attackers?
It doesn't surprise me, if I'm being honest. Motivated attackers aren't usually deterred by any kind of soft level barrier. Actually, just recently, there's been a push to re-describe an active shooter to an active aggressor, because you're starting to see more things like knives, pipes, cars, things of that nature. Because if the person is set on causing that chaos or causing that issue, in whatever location it will be, a line of officers isn't necessarily going to stop them. They're still going to try. That's where we have to be better at response. We have to be better at kind of figuring out through those teams or through other resources whether or not we have a behavioral health issue. Do we have something that's becoming a threat? The true mitigator is the community and how well the community works together, how well we talk to each other. Do we know each other? Do you know the person sitting next to you? Do you know when they're not having a good day? That's the true mitigator in these attacks and these threats. We can't wait until they're on property causing a problem to determine like, oh, we have armed guards. This started 8 months ago. This started a year ago. We're seeing the results today. So it doesn't surprise me.
We just saw the most meaningful legislation passed recently. It basically reinforced background checks. Statista Research Department just updated and released a study a few days ago that 93 of the mass shootings in the United States between 1982 and February 2023 involved weapons which were obtained illegally, or legally, excuse me. A clear majority, that only 16 incidents involved guns that were obtained illegally. 23 are unknown at this time. At what point are we doing enough to try to keep the bad guys from obtaining weapons when clearly they're disappearing in the crowd and obtaining legally anyways? You know, I think this could be a reason that there's such a divide in our country when you look at both extreme ends of the spectrum. Some say take away all guns, and some just push and rally behind the Second Amendment. So where's the middle ground, and how do we get here?
It's really hard to find that. It feels like almost it's evasive. It is two polar opposite opinions with very little opportunity for the middle. And unfortunately, there's a lot of political discussions right now. If you think of immigration, abortion, guns, these are classic wedge issues where people really feel divided. I think you mentioned, like, how do we prevent bad guys from getting a hold of guns? And to Chief Pate's point, like, they don't always look bad initially, but we don't make that assessment until something happens. So for the example of background checks and the different ideological perspectives, if you've never had a problem, it would be a violation of the Constitution and the Second Amendment to say, well, we're not going to let you have it. It's until you've had a problem that then there's the question of if it comes up. But many people haven't. The red flags haven't come up. People don't necessarily know in advance. And I think the ideological challenge, specifically with the Second Amendment and a lot of the policies and the divide between it, quite frankly, is that the language itself is very ambiguous. It's not very clear. It never mentions background checks. It doesn't talk about types of weapons. It doesn't talk about mental health or fly lists or anything that would I think in some ways assuage some of the divide ideologically between those who say we absolutely have to respond to what's going on right now and those that say we need to make sure we're using the Constitution in making that decision.
Right. We live in a gun-positive state. This is very obvious and clear. So it's unlikely that we would see any legislation pushed to remove firearms from citizens. Regarding school safety specifically, some parents and citizens think that teachers should be the ones to prevent this and be armed on campuses and in classrooms. From a political science perspective first, is this a valid solution?
We haven't seen a place where this policy is played out. So if you're analyzing the policy, you'd say, okay, well, where have they done this and how has it worked? There are a lot of really fair criticisms to this, namely, do you want your kindergarten teacher being armed? Is that really what they're trying to do? Certainly if we're talking about Indiana politics, we have a teacher shortage. We have a hard time recruiting and retaining quality teachers. Do you think asking them to do this is going to make that easier or harder? And what are we paying them for this additional protection for the safety of our students? I think there would be a lot of questions there that we'd have to consider. But the biggest thing, the neat thing about having differences in state government and policy is if there is a state that does this, we'd be able to watch and look, and if we liked it, we can adopt it or adapt it. We haven't seen anything like that has been effective that would make that argument really easy to say, we're gonna follow the model that whatever state does because we know it makes a difference. We have not seen that, so I'm cautious for just trying it out and guessing and engineering this on our own.
And I'm curious, just because of you obviously teaching on campus and being a professor, what is your personal opinion? How would you feel as a professor if you were told that you would have to be the one to be armed in your own classroom full of students and be tasked with potentially firing at an active shooter?
It's a horrifying thought. Joking, I have horrible hand-eye coordination, so anyone who knows that would not want me being in charge of my own personal responsibility, let alone any other group of students. But I cannot think of anything that is, to use the word again, more horrifying. And that's certainly not why I became a professor, and that's not why I'm involved in academia, and my students mean the world to me. But to have to literally protect their lives is genuinely terrifying.
Absolutely. I can only imagine how that would make you feel. Officer Pate, I'm curious your perspective. What do you feel would be an effective solution?
Well, how much time do I get? Arming teachers is not an effective solution. And absent policy that exists, I'll stand on those arguments, but even if we had it, I have a lot of questions. Are you ready to pull the trigger? Are you trained? What standards are you being trained to? Because you're in a room every day with kids. So I would hope your standards are much higher than the standards that I'm living with. Are you aware that you're now putting 20, 30, 40, 50 guns in a building that had none until the shooter showed up? Can you promise me that you won't be overpowered by one of your students that gets your weapon? You've added more weapons to the fight, and you haven't proven to me that you've increased the training standard or competency of the person holding the weapon. What happens when my team enters the building? There's 20 teachers with guns in there. Which one's the shooter? I have no idea. I have a lot of hurdles that exist between me and teachers having weapons or any other administrator having a weapon. And it starts with responsibility, care. Are you qualified? Are you trained? Will you pass consistently firearms protocol training? Can you take that shot if you need to? Otherwise, it's a paperweight or it's a weapon against you. I don't like it.
Yeah. So right now we are going to watch a video from Marcy Creevy, an MSU student who was on campus the night of the shooting. This is her firsthand account of her experience, which she posted on TikTok just 4 days after the shooting occurred.
So I documented my story of what happened when I was in the Union building on February 13th, and I thought I would just share it. I'm not looking for sympathy or anything, nothing like that. I'm simply just trying to share my story about what I went through, because the sad truth of it is that maybe it could educate or help someone in the future if they have to go through what we had to go through that night. So here goes, and it's quite lengthy, so I don't know how long this video is going to be or what, but yeah. For the past few weeks, I've been studying at the library, but since my water bottle broke earlier that morning, I went to the Union to get a new one and then study there. My favorite place to study there is in the quiet room on the first floor, but it was too busy, so I went up to the second. At this point, it was about 8 p.m., and I began studying. 20 minutes later, the room I was in illuminated with red and blue lights. I peered out the window thinking maybe there was just a minor accident. I went back to my study area, picked up my phone, and saw a text from my best friend Haerle that read, "Don't go outside." So I went back to the window and looked down further to see rifles pointed up at where I was. Cops on the lawn with their rifles pointed at the building I was in. I was with no friends, so I ran to the two girls across the room from me and said, "Does anyone know what's going on?" They were sitting at a table closest to the door. That's when I heard a woman scream, "Shoot her," and run down the hallway. You know when you can hear the fear in someone's voice? It was just like that, screaming bloody murder. Then I heard a loud hollow noise, and from there my fight or flight kicked in. I still can't comprehend how it was if my body knew exactly what to do when all my heart wanted to do was cry, scream, and break. I turned the lights off, ran to the other room and shut those doors and turned those lights off. 4 others appeared from the other room, and that's when I told everyone to get behind the wall and under the table. We crouched under there, and I pulled out my phone, my family, the first people I thought of. I wanted to call my mom to hear her voice. I didn't want to make noise, though, so I silenced my phone. As I did that, she texted me first saying, "Where are you?" I responded and said, "I'm hiding under a table. I'm at the Union. I'm okay." This was at 8:33 p.m. The girl next to me was sobbing. She called her mom, and my mom was in Mexico. I looked at the girl next to me and said, "My parents are in Mexico." She said, "Oh my God, they're in Mexico?" And she squeezed my hand, and somehow I was completely frozen. I felt empty, not scared, nothing. I had 2 girls next to me, both shaken up. The one to my right was very scared, rightfully so. So I put my arm around her and asked her what her name was. Between sobs, she said, "Mia." I said, "Mia, we're gonna be okay, I promise you, please just trust me." I held her for a moment, then realized I needed to do something. I checked my phone to see my dad's first text, which read, "Be smart, always give yourself an out." He sent this at 8:36 p.m. I texted him back and said, "I'm trying to hold them together." I knew my parents have taught me how to protect myself and fight. So I told the 6 people next to me that I was going to get up to barricade the door. I stood up, and as I stood up, I saw the mass of red and blue lights grew even more from when I first saw it. I ran to the doors of the room and began pushing a table. At that point, I heard a deep man's voice yelling from the hallway, "The shooter." My immediate thought was, that's him outside these doors. I went to run back under the table, but a voice in my head told me to walk. I think we all know whose voice that was. If I walked, that meant I would calm the others down. So I walked and crawled back under, and I think that's when they realized I was back so soon. That was a bad sign. The crying continued and elevated more, but I kept telling the people around me, "I promise all of you we're going to be okay." I kept making that promise. I made that promise so many times after I was sure I heard the shooter outside the doors. I sat there still calm, planning on what I was going to do when the shooter entered. My first thought was that I'd play dead. This is what my mom always taught me. But then I thought to myself, he'd actually have to shoot someone first if I could play dead. So who was it going to be? Knowing myself and how I face violence, I was going to defend as hard as I could. My mom would have hated me for that, to defend and fight back instead of thinking extremely tactically. I again keep going back to that feeling of calmness. Nothing will ever compare to that. Why can't I ever feel that calm during the little things, like a big exam, a job interview, or a first date? At that point, the doors began to have banging on them. "No one move," I said. We all assumed it was the cops coming to find us, but from the stories I've heard and watched, I wasn't going to move or speak until I physically saw a cop in front of us. Flashlights appeared on the wall in front of us. A man turned the corner and his flashlight hit our faces. "I got kids. I got some. I have 7. Another cop appeared around the corner. "I got 7. I got 7, they kept saying. He was stern, but he was scared. I just know it. The other cop yelled, "Put your hands in the air," while his other guy said, "It's okay. You're all going to be okay. We're all going to get you guys out of here." And that's when I lost it. It was as if I was holding my breath for the past 22 minutes, as if I wasn't taking anything in, and when I raised my hands above my head, I could finally breathe again.
It's a really heavy thing to watch, and I know it hits home for me being a student, watching those things, knowing that people my age have to experience them. And I noticed an emotional reaction from a couple of you here, and I know you're a mom, and it's very heavy, hard to watch. Obviously, with that being said, I think initial reaction for a lot of people is shock, heartbreak, but to some degree, we hear of it so often that I would hate to use the word desensitized, but that's almost what it feels like sometimes. Officer Pate, how important is it that we watch these firsthand accounts and remember that these are real people and we must not become desensitized to these things?
I think it's paramount because desensitization leads to not communicating with us and telling us the problems that you're seeing. You start to walk by and go, that's an everyday thing. I see this happen, we're gonna have this, we're gonna have that. And it does not help the collective team here that wants to keep the campus safe. So desensitization is not something that we wanna see pushed across the community. We want the community to be aware of each other and to look out for each other.
Absolutely, and I want to bring this back to UIndy specifically because I know all of us here, safety is a top priority. So how do we get there? Dr. Ward, is there currently any professor training for active shooters that you're aware of?
The active shooter training is this guy right here, Pate, but so I know that they're working really closely with that. My role is more along the lines of reporting and working closely with the police, which reporting is really easy. It's as easy as on the back of every bathroom stall, there's a Title IX paper there that you literally can scan a QR code if you see something weird. Submit a Title IX report. They go to me. I'm the only one that sees them, right? And if I need to get those to someone else, I can. Or as easy, if something happens, text 911, right? So we are it's a lot easier to text than it is to call sometimes. So Officer Pate and I work really, really closely together. And so if someone calls the police, I'm going to also see that report later when it's not as critical, obviously. And that's where our behavioral intervention and threat assessment teams come in as well.
Okay. So I guess that is a better question for you then. Can you speak to some of the training that have you been involved with any professor training in that?
Yeah, there's two types of trainings that's pushed out. There's an initial training which kind of lays the foundation of run, hide, fight, of what we're looking for from anybody in the campus community. If you can run, run. If you can't, hide. And if you have to fight, fight. Be ready to do that. We also offer individual training in your space. So if you reach out to the police department and let's say you're with criminal justice and you want us to come in and walk with you through that space that you occupy and exist and talk about what your options are and what you can do to best protect yourself, we do that. You just have to reach out and ask, and we're happy to go by. Myself and Sergeant Gaines and Sergeant Truax, we're all trained in active shooter response. We're active shooter instructors. We've built trainings for the state. I'm a certified evaluator for active shooter training. So we're happy to come out to the spaces and actually walk through it and work with people in their own space that they occupy.
I guess either of you could answer this as well. What are some of those key things to look for? If we see any sort of suspicious behavior, obviously we would report it, but what is that classified suspicious behavior? What is that?
Yeah, I'll get us started and then Pate can catch on. I would say if you see someone that you're like, I don't think they belong here, right? So we're somewhat of an urban campus, I would say. So it's really easy for people to come onto our campus. So if you see someone that you're like, I don't really think they belong, it's always better to call than not to call, right? We also are Midwestern, and so we want to be nice and open doors for people and do those kind of things. And every time that someone gets into a property, that's the way it happens, right? So if anyone is acting out of the ordinary, I would say, saying things that are a little alarming, I would say just use discretion and call, because it's always better to be wrong and have called and it not be a threat than to have seen something and it was a threat and you didn't say anything.
Yeah, I'll back onto that and say any noticeable change of behavior in someone that you know or that you're around constantly, you start to see that they've withdrawn or that they're not being as involved as they used to be, or they're starting to talk in a more self-destructive type manner, or just making off-the-wall comments about shooting events or weapons or mass casualty type stuff. Don't let that slide by. You can always reach out to us anonymously and we will take it seriously. It doesn't mean we're going to pull anybody in and interrogate them. Mm-hmm. It means that we're going to use the methods that we have between our teams to figure out, okay, where do we land on this particular situation?
Absolutely. And this is a topic that we could talk about for hours, but thank you so much for being willing to come on and start this important conversation with me today. Again, thank you all for joining me. I'm Hannah Haerle, and this is Real Talk.